At 63, my children took everything. My home, my savings, my dignity. They left me with a deed to a flooded cellar no one wanted. A final, pitying gesture they thought proved their generosity. But what they didn't know, what they could never have understood, is that my husband had left me something else entirely. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever had to start over when you thought the story was already written, then stick with me. This story is for you. Hit that subscribe button because we're about to find out what was really buried in the dark. The moving truck grumbled at the curb, a beast with its belly full of my life. I stood across the street, a ghost haunting the edge of my own memories. The windows of the house, the one Robert and I had built with more hope than money, stared back at me, blank and indifferent. A new family, young and bright with a future, was directing the movers. A little girl with blonde pigtails chased a ball across the lawn I had mowed just last Tuesday. My lawn. It wasn't my lawn anymore. In my hand, I clutched the two things my son Mark had pressed into it that morning. One was a single, tarnished brass key. The other was a folded, crisp legal document. The deed to a property in Blackwater Creek, a town we'd left behind 30 years ago. "It's not much, Mom," he'd said, his eyes avoiding mine, a flicker of something, shame maybe, or just impatience, crossing his face. "But it's yours, free and clear. Dad kept it for some reason. At least you'll have an asset." An asset. That's what I was to them now. A collection of assets to be managed, liquidated, and tidied away. The house, the stocks Robert had so carefully chosen, the small annuity I thought was my safety net, all of it had been transferred into a trust managed by my children, Mark and Jessica. They'd sat me down in a lawyer's office that smelled of expensive leather and quiet predation. They used words like stewardship and legacy and protecting you from complexity. They said it was to make my golden years easier. I, a fool wrapped in the warm blanket of a mother's trust, had signed the papers. I signed away the sturdy oak tree of my life, and they handed me back a single, rotting leaf. The property, the one this key belonged to, was described in the county records as a single-story commercial structure with a non-functional basement. Non-functional was a polite term. The last report, dated a decade ago, mentioned permanent flooding due to a compromised foundation and proximity to the water table. A flooded cellar, that was my inheritance. The sky above was the color of a bruise, heavy and gray. It began to drizzle, the drops cold against my cheeks, mingling with the two silent tears that finally escaped. I turned away from the house. There was nothing left for me there. The past was now occupied by strangers. I walked to the bus stop, the key feeling impossibly heavy in my pocket. A dead weight, pulling me toward a future I couldn't imagine. The bus ride was 3 hours of watching the world blur past my window. Green suburbs gave way to strip malls, then to the long, empty stretches of farmland that stitched the state together. With each mile, I felt myself shrinking. The woman who had raised 2 children, nursed a sick husband, managed a household, and volunteered at the local library was dissolving. In her place was a caricature, a confused old woman, a burden, a problem that had been neatly solved. I clutched my single suitcase, which held a few changes of clothes, Robert's photograph, and a well-worn copy of a book he'd given me. It felt like all I had left of a shared world. Blackwater Creek wasn't a place you arrived at. It was a place you ended up. The bus hissed to a stop in front of a boarded-up diner, its sign promising friendship and fine food in faded, peeling letters. The town looked tired, worn down by time and economic neglect. The main street was a collection of brick buildings with dusty windows, some empty, some housing businesses that seemed to be surviving on sheer stubbornness. A laundromat, a bail bonds office, a hardware store with a hand-painted sign. My property, according to the deed, was 2 blocks off Main, on a street named for a tree that no longer grew there. I walked, my suitcase bumping along the cracked sidewalk. The air smelled of damp earth and river water. It was a smell I remembered. Robert and I had lived here for 2 years, right after we were married, in a tiny rented apartment above a bakery. He was working his first engineering job at the old mill. They were hard years, but they were happy. We were poor in money, but rich in time, in the simple, unshakable belief that we were building something that would last. It seemed a bitter irony that I was returning to the site of our beginning, at what felt so much like my end. The building stood at the corner of Elm and River Street, just as the map described. It was worse than I had imagined. A squat brick box with boarded-up windows and a sagging roof. Weeds grew in thick clumps around its foundation, fighting for space with discarded bottles and sun-bleached trash. A faded sign hung crookedly over the door, the ghost of letters spelling out something about machine repair. This was Robert's secret asset. This was my kingdom. I stood before the graffiti-scarred door, the brass key in my trembling hand. It felt like a test. Could I even bring myself to open it? A part of me wanted to turn around, to get back on the bus and just disappear. But where would I go? I was a ship whose anchors had been cut, set adrift by my own children. This ruin, this forgotten piece of my husband's past, was the only shore in sight. I took a deep breath, the damp air filling my lungs. Then, I slid the key into the lock. It resisted, gritty with rust and disuse. For a moment, I thought it was the wrong key, another dead end. But I put my shoulder into it, using the weight of my body, the weight of my grief and my anger, and with a final, groaning click, the lock turned. The door swung inward on a single, protesting hinge, opening into darkness. The smell that rolled out was thick and ancient, the smell of trapped water, of decay, of time itself turning to dust. It was the smell of absolute stillness, of a place the world had forgotten. I stepped across the threshold, from the gray afternoon into a pocket of night. My hand fumbled along the wall, searching for a light switch I knew wouldn't work. The only light came from the open doorway behind me, a weak, rectangular patch on the floor that barely illuminated the space. The ground floor was one large, cavernous room. Debris littered the concrete floor. An overturned metal desk lay in one corner, its drawers pulled out and empty. In the center of the room, like a tombstone, was a heavy wooden door set flat into the floor, secured with a thick, rusted iron hasp. The cellar door. I walked toward it, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The air grew colder, heavier. I knelt down, my knees complaining on the hard concrete, and ran my hand over the rough wood. There was no padlock on the hasp, just a simple slide bolt. It was stiff, but I managed to work it free. It pulled back with a screech of metal on metal that set my teeth on edge. Now came the hard part. The door had 2 recessed iron rings for handles. I hooked my fingers through them and pulled. It was like trying to lift the world. It barely budged. I repositioned myself, planting my feet, and pulled again, grunting with the effort. It was a fight. Me against the damp, the rot, the sheer dead weight of neglect. Slowly, agonizingly, the door began to lift, groaning in protest. I propped it open with my back, my muscles screaming, and wrestled it upright until it leaned against the far wall with a heavy thud that shook the floor. I peered down into the darkness. A set of steep wooden stairs led down into blackness, and from that blackness came the sound I had been expecting, the gentle lapping sound of water. I couldn't see it, but I could smell it, feel its cold breath on my face. A flooded cellar. It was real. My son hadn't been lying about that. For a long time, I just stood there, staring into the abyss. This was it, the sum total of my life's worth. A dark, wet hole in the ground. A wave of despair, so powerful it almost knocked me off my feet, washed over me. It was a cold, empty feeling. The realization that I was utterly and completely alone. My children didn't want me. My husband was gone. My home was a memory. I was 63 years old with no money, no plan, and no one to call. I sank to the floor, my back against the cold wall, and I finally let myself cry. I cried for the woman I used to be. I cried for the husband I missed with every breath. I cried for the children I had lost, not to death, but to something far crueler. I cried until there were no tears left, just a hollow ache in my chest. And in that hollow place, a tiny, unfamiliar seed began to sprout. It wasn't hope. It was something harder, something sharper. It was anger, a cold, quiet rage. How dare they? How dare they do this to me? How dare they decide my life was over? I got to my feet. My legs were shaky, but they held. I looked back down into the dark cellar. Robert had kept this place. He was a practical man, a meticulous engineer. He didn't do things without a reason. He wouldn't have held on to a worthless, flooded property for 30 years for sentiment alone. There had to be something more. There had to be a reason. My eyes adjusted to the gloom, and I could just make out the top few steps of the staircase. I needed a light. My suitcase was still by the front door. Inside, tucked in a side pocket, was a small, cheap flashlight I kept for emergencies. This, I thought with a grim smile, certainly qualified as an emergency. The beam of the flashlight was weak, a pale yellow circle in the oppressive dark. But it was enough. It cut through the blackness, revealing the wooden steps, slick with damp and moss. Below them, the light reflected off the surface of still black water. It was about 4 feet down, filling the cellar to what looked like knee height. The walls were made of old hand-laid stone, glistening with moisture. The air was thick, suffocating. I held the light steady, panning it across the surface of the water. Debris floated here and there, scraps of wood, a plastic bottle, things that had fallen in over the years. I swept the beam along the walls, following the line where the stone met the low ceiling. And that's when I saw it. On the far wall, perched on a wide stone ledge just a few inches above the waterline, was a box. It wasn't wood. It looked like metal, dark and heavy. It was square, about the size of a small toolbox, and it had a heavy-duty latch on the front. It was placed too deliberately, too neatly to be an accident. Someone had put it there. Someone had put it there knowing the water would rise, but not high enough to reach it. My heart began to beat a little faster. Robert. It had to be Robert. He had put it there. My mind raced. How could I get to it? The stairs were too rotten to trust. I couldn't wade through that filthy water. I had no idea what was in it, how deep it really was, or what was lurking on the floor beneath. I went back upstairs, my mind working. I searched the main room, kicking through piles of debris. In the corner, behind the overturned desk, I found a long piece of conduit, maybe 10 feet long. It was thin but rigid. It would have to do. I went back to the cellar opening, my plan forming. I lay on my stomach on the dusty floor, my head and shoulders hanging over the edge, and stretched the pipe down toward the box. The end of the conduit clinked against the metal. It was heavier than it looked. My first few attempts to nudge it off the ledge failed. The pipe would slip, or the box would just scrape along the stone without moving. My arms started to ache from the awkward angle. Sweat trickled down my forehead. "Come on, Robert," I whispered into the darkness. "Help me out here." I took a deep breath, braced myself, and gave it one last, desperate shove. The box tilted, teetered for a heart-stopping second on the edge of the shelf, and then fell with a loud splash into the water. It sank immediately. A string of bubbles rose to the surface, and then nothing. I stared at the spot where it had disappeared, my stomach clenching. I had failed. I had just sent the only clue, the only possible answer, to the bottom of a dark, inaccessible pool of water. The anger from before curdled back into despair. It was a stupid plan. I was a stupid old woman playing detective in a ruin. My children were right. I couldn't manage. I lay there for what felt like an hour, the cold from the concrete seeping into my bones, the smell of the cellar filling my senses. But then, another thought pushed its way through the fog of my self-pity. Robert was an engineer. He was a man who thought of contingencies, who planned for failure. Would he have put something important in a simple metal box and left it vulnerable to a clumsy nudge? Or would he have planned for that, too? I got up and aimed the flashlight back at the water. I couldn't see the bottom, but the box was metal. It was heavy. It wouldn't have floated away. It would be directly below the ledge where it had been sitting. It was still there. It was just out of reach. For now. I spent the night on the floor of the empty building, wrapped in my coat with my suitcase for a pillow. Sleep was fleeting, filled with dreams of dark water and my children's smiling faces turning to masks of contempt. I woke up stiff and cold, but with a renewed sense of purpose. I was going to get that box. I walked back to the main street, a woman on a mission. The hardware store was open, its bell jingling cheerfully as I entered. A young man with a kind face and sawdust in his hair looked up from behind the counter. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked. I must have looked aside. A 63-year-old woman, disheveled from sleeping on a concrete floor, probably with dust on her cheek. "I need to pump water out of a basement," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "A lot of water." He led me to the back of the store, to the rental section. He showed me a submersible pump, a heavy cast-iron thing with a long, thick hose. He explained how it worked, how much it cost per day. It was more than I could afford. I had a few $100s in cash tucked away, emergency money I hadn't told the children about. It was all I had in the world. Using a chunk of it on a pump felt reckless, a gamble. But what other choice did I have? I looked at the pump, then at the young man. "I'll take it," I said. "And I'll need a generator. There's no power at the building." An hour later, I was dragging the equipment back down the street. The generator was on wheels, but it was heavy. The pump was awkward. People on the street stared at me. This strange old woman wrestling with industrial equipment. I didn't care. I had a purpose. Setting it up was a challenge. I had watched Robert work on enough projects over the years to have a basic understanding of mechanics, but this was different. I read the instructions, my lips moving as I tried to make sense of the diagrams. I connected the hose, lowered the pump into the dark water until I heard it thud on the cellar floor, and then turned my attention to the generator. It took 3 pulls on the cord, each one jarring my shoulder, before it roared to life, filling the empty building with a deafening noise and the smell of gasoline. I plugged in the pump. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a shudder, the hose stiffened. I ran to the front door and aimed the end of the hose out into the weed-choked alley. A torrent of foul-smelling, murky water gushed out. It was working. It was actually working. I watched the water pour out, a thick brown river carrying away decades of neglect. I felt a surge of triumph so fierce it almost made me dizzy. It was a small victory, but it was mine. I had done it myself. The pumping took all day and into the night. I sat on the floor, listening to the drone of the generator, watching the water level in the cellar slowly, impossibly drop. I bought a sandwich and a bottle of water from a small convenience store, the first food I'd eaten in almost 24 hours. As darkness fell, I shone my flashlight down the stairs. The top steps were fully exposed now, dark and slick. The water was down by at least 2 feet. I could see the outlines of things on the floor, shapes emerging from the murk. It was like watching a lost continent rise from the sea. By the next morning, the generator had run out of gas. The building fell silent. The silence was different now, not empty, but expectant. I refilled the tank and started it again. By midday, the pump began to gurgle and spit. It was sucking air. The cellar was empty. I turned everything off and stood at the top of the stairs, my heart pounding. The flashlight beam revealed a stone floor, coated in a thick layer of dark, foul-smelling silt. And there, right below the ledge, lying on its side in the muck, was the metal box. I took the stairs carefully. They were slippery, but they held my weight. The air was thick with the smell of river mud and rot. My shoes sank into the silt on the floor. I made my way to the box and knelt down. It was heavier than I imagined, made of thick steel. The latch was a heavy-duty clasp, the kind used on military equipment. It was locked. Of course it was locked. I carried it upstairs, my arm straining. I set it down on the dusty floor, my treasure. I had no tools to open it. I would have to go back to the hardware store. But as I ran my hands over the cold metal, my fingers brushed against a small welded protrusion on the side. It was a tiny waterproof key holder, the magnetic kind people use to hide a spare car key. It was covered in grime, almost perfectly camouflaged. With a shaking hand, I pried the plastic cover off. Inside, snug in a small foam cutout, was a small silver key. Robert, you brilliant, thoughtful man. I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a smooth, satisfying click. I lifted the lid. The inside was perfectly dry. There was no money, no jewelry, no treasure in the conventional sense. But to me, it was more valuable than gold. Nestled in a bed of faded velvet were 3 leather-bound journals, a thick manila envelope sealed with wax, and a single folded photograph. It was a picture of me and Robert, taken on our wedding day. We were so young, standing in front of that little apartment over the bakery here in Blackwater Creek, squinting in the sun, our faces alight with a future we thought we understood. I picked up the envelope first. My name was written on the front in Robert's familiar, precise handwriting. Eleanor. I broke the seal. Inside was a letter, several pages long. I sat down on the floor, my back against the wall, and began to read. My dearest Eleanor, it began. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and things have not gone as we planned. I hope with all my heart that our children have done right by you, that they have shown you the love and respect you deserve. But I was an engineer, my love, and an engineer always prepares for the worst-case scenario. I saw a hardness in them, a practicality that bordered on ruthlessness. I fear their love for you might one day be outweighed by their love for what you have. A cold knot formed in my stomach. He had seen it. All those years ago, he had seen the potential for this betrayal. I read on, my eyes devouring his words. I could never tell you about this while I was alive. It would have felt like a betrayal of our own children, planting a seed of doubt that I hoped would never need to sprout. But I had to create a fail-safe, a lifeboat, just for you. This place, this building, is that lifeboat. Our children see it as a worthless liability. They are wrong. What is down in that cellar, Eleanor, is not a problem. It is the solution. I looked around the empty, decaying building. I thought of the filthy, silt-covered cellar below. A solution? What could he possibly mean? His letter continued, explaining the history of the property. He had bought it not for the building, but for what was underneath it. The town of Blackwater Creek was built on a network of natural underground springs. The flooding in the cellar wasn't from a compromised foundation, it was intentional. I didn't just let the spring flood the basement, Eleanor. I tapped it. I designed and built a containment and filtration system. The water in that cellar is not stagnant floodwater. It is pure, clean spring water, constantly replenishing itself. I sealed the cellar to protect what I built down there. I let the town records show it as flooded and non-functional to keep it off the radar, to ensure its value would be assessed at next to nothing, so no one would ever look too closely, especially not our financially minded children. My head was spinning. A spring? A filtration system? It sounded like something out of a novel. I was a 63-year-old woman, not a water baron. What was I supposed to do with a secret spring? The journals will explain the technical details, the letter went on. Everything you need to know is in there. The schematics, the maintenance schedules, the geological surveys I commissioned. It is a legacy, Eleanor. Not of money, but of ingenuity. Something real. Something you can build on. There is also a second box, a larger one, hidden behind the false wall at the north end of the cellar. The key from our wedding photograph is not for a door, it's for that box. Inside you will find the seed money I saved, cash, hidden away from any bank account our children could find. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to start. I looked at the photograph in my lap, Robert and I, smiling. The key. I had always thought it was just a romantic keepsake from our first apartment. He'd had it framed with the photo. It had hung in our hallway for 40 years. My children had let me take it because it had sentimental value. They had no idea. The final paragraph of his letter made the tears start again. This is your second chance, my love. A chance to build something for yourself. Don't let them define you. Don't let their greed be the final chapter in your story. You are the strongest person I have ever known. You are my foundation, Eleanor. Now let this place be yours. All my love, forever, Robert. I sat there for a long time, the letter in my lap, his words echoing in the silent building. He had known me. He had trusted me. While our children saw a helpless old woman, my husband had seen a partner, a builder, a force to be reckoned with. He hadn't left me a ruin. He had left me a blueprint. The next few days were a blur of work. I used the money from Robert's first box, the one I'd pulled from the water, to buy cleaning supplies, heavy-duty boots, and a powerful pressure washer. I spent hours in that cellar, spraying away the thick layer of silt, revealing the stone floor, and, more importantly, Robert's work. It was exactly as he'd described. Tucked against one wall was a complex array of stainless steel pipes, valves, and filters, all coated in grime but otherwise looking solid and well-built. It looked like a machine from a science fiction film. On the north wall, I found the false section of stone he'd written about. It was cleverly done. Without knowing it was there, you would never have noticed. Using a crowbar from the hardware store, I pried the stones loose. Behind them was a recess, and in that recess, a heavy steel door. In the center of the door was a small, ornate keyhole. With a trembling hand, I took the old brass key from the wedding photograph and slid it into the lock. It was a perfect fit. The door opened into a small, dry, concrete-lined chamber. Inside was a large, military-style footlocker. I lifted the lid. It was filled with bundles of cash, neatly wrapped and sealed in plastic. And on top of the money was another letter. This one was shorter. This should be enough to get the system certified, to hire a lawyer, and to live on while you get started. The lawyer you need is a man named Arthur Davies. He's young, but he's sharp and honest. His father was a friend of mine. Tell him you're Robert's wife. He'll understand. Be brave, Eleanor. Your story is just beginning. Arthur Davies. The name was familiar. I'd seen his shingle on Main Street. A. Davies, attorney at law. He was the one I needed to see. The first meeting with Mr. Davies was not encouraging. His office was small and tidy, and he was, as Robert had written, very young. He listened patiently as I told my story, his face a mask of professional sympathy. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his tone gentle, the kind you use on a confused relative. "It's a remarkable story, truly. Your late husband was clearly a man of considerable imagination. But a secret water filtration system in a flooded cellar? Cash hidden in a wall? From a legal standpoint, this is problematic." He explained the hurdles, the water rights, the health department certifications, the zoning laws. He talked about the cost of testing, the permits, the sheer unlikelihood of it all. Frankly, he concluded, the most practical course of action would be to sell the property as is. A developer might pay a small sum for the land value. It would give you a little nest egg, a fresh start. He was dismissing me. He was patting me on the head and telling me to take the easy way out. He saw the same thing my children saw, an old woman with a fantasy. The old Eleanor, the one from a week ago, would have shrunk under his calm, rational gaze. She would have nodded, thanked him for his time, and walked away defeated. But I wasn't that Eleanor anymore. I looked him straight in the eye. "My husband was the finest engineer this state has ever produced," I said, my voice low and steady. "He was not a man of imagination. He was a man of facts, of physics, of things that work. I am not selling. I am hiring you to help me get this business operational. I will pay for your time and for all necessary tests and permits. In cash." I reached into my bag and pulled out one of the thick bundles of money from the footlocker, placing it squarely in the middle of his polished desk. "That," I said, "is your retainer." Mr. Davies stared at the money, then back at me. For the first time, his professional mask slipped. He saw something else in my eyes. He saw Robert's wife. The weeks that followed were a battle on two fronts. The first was the physical restoration of the cellar. I hired a local teenager named Leo to help me. He was a good kid, saving up for a car, and he wasn't afraid of hard work. Together, we scrubbed every inch of Robert's system. I spent my evenings poring over the journals, learning the schematics, understanding the elegant simplicity of his design. It was like learning a new language, the language of my husband's mind. He had designed it to be durable and easy to maintain. He had built it to last. The second battle was bureaucratic. Mr. Davies, now a reluctant but committed ally, began the long process of navigating the labyrinth of state and local regulations. He sent water samples to a lab for testing. He filed for zoning variances. He scheduled inspections. Every step was met with skepticism and red tape. "They think you're a crackpot, Eleanor," he told me one afternoon over the phone, his voice tinged with a newfound frustration on my behalf. "They see an old woman and an abandoned building, and they can't compute." "Then we'll have to show them," I said. The first turning point came with the lab results. The water was purer than any municipal water in the state. It was perfectly balanced, rich in minerals, and completely free of contaminants. The geologist Mr. Davies hired confirmed it came from a deep, protected aquifer. It wasn't just water, it was a premium product. The news of my project began to spread through the small town. People would stop and stare at the building as I came and went. The hardware store owner gave me a discount on supplies. The woman who ran the diner started saving me a hot meal at the end of each day. I was no longer the strange old woman. I was becoming that woman who's fixing up the old machine shop. I was becoming part of the town. Of course, the news eventually reached my children. The phone call came from Mark. His voice was tight with a kind of baffled anger. "What are you doing, Mom? We heard you're squatting in that old building. People are saying you've lost your mind. We're worried about you." "I'm not squatting, Mark," I said calmly. "I'm starting a business." There was a pause. I could hear him talking to Jessica in the background. "A business? Mom, that's absurd. That place is a teardown. We've had an offer from a developer. They want to put up a parking lot. It's a good offer. It's money for you, for your care." "I don't need their money," I said, "and I don't need your care. This property is mine, and it's not for sale." I could feel his frustration mounting. "We are your children. We have a right to be concerned. If you're not competent to manage your own affairs." The threat hung in the air, unspoken but clear. They were going to try to have me declared incompetent. They were going to try to take this from me, too. "I have a lawyer, Mark," I said. My voice is cold and hard as the stone in my cellar. "His name is Arthur Davies. You can direct any further inquiries to him." I hung up the phone. My hand was shaking, but not from fear. It was from the sheer, clarifying power of my own resolve. The legal challenge came, just as I knew it would. My children filed a petition for conservatorship, claiming I was delusional and unable to care for myself or my finances. We all ended up in a sterile courtroom in the county seat. Mark and Jessica sat on one side with their expensive lawyer, looking concerned and sorrowful. It was a masterful performance. I sat with Mr. Davies on the other. He had the lab reports, the geological surveys, the business plan we had drafted, and sworn affidavits from half a dozen people in Blackwater Creek attesting to my hard work and clear-headedness. But his trump card was the final inspection report from the state health department, which had arrived just the day before. The inspector, a notoriously tough old man who had initially been my fiercest critic, had given the system his full approval. He had called it a work of engineering genius. When Mr. Davies presented the evidence, the judge, a woman with tired but intelligent eyes, looked over the documents carefully. She looked at my children, then she looked at me. "It seems to me," she said, her voice dry, "that Mrs. Vance is not the one in this room with a tenuous grip on reality." Petition denied. It was over. I had won. Walking out of that courthouse was like taking my first breath after being underwater for a very long time. I was free. The last phase was the most rewarding. With the legal hurdles cleared, I focused on building the business. I named it Robert Spring. Leo, the teenager who had helped me clean, became my first employee. We started small, bottling the water by hand and selling it at the local farmers market. People loved the story. They loved the water. Soon, local restaurants and shops wanted to carry it. I had to buy professional bottling equipment. I hired 2 more people from the town. The old abandoned building on the corner of Elm and River was humming with life again. I never became a millionaire. That was never the point. But I built a good, honest business that provided for me and for my employees. I had a purpose. I had a community. I had a home. I never reconciled with my children. They sent a letter once, through their lawyer, offering a kind of truce. But the words were hollow, full of justifications, not apologies. I sent a polite reply back, wishing them well, but making it clear that the door was closed. Some wounds are too deep to be healed. Forgiveness is not forgetting, and I could never forget what it felt like to be discarded. Sometimes, late at night, I go down to the cellar. The air is cool and clean, and the sound of the pumps is a steady, reassuring heartbeat. I run my hand over the cold steel of Robert's system, and I feel him there with me. He didn't just leave me a business. He left me a reminder of who I am. They thought they were leaving me with nothing but a flooded hole in the ground, a final, insulting footnote at the end of my life. But they were wrong. They left me with everything that truly matters, a second chance, a test of my own strength, and a love story that was stronger than greed and deeper than stone. If you're sitting in your own flooded cellar right now, metaphorically or literally, I want you to know this: you are stronger than you think. The answers you're looking for might be buried under years of neglect and disappointment, but they are there. Sometimes you have to pump out all the darkness to find the light that was waiting for you all along. What's one thing you've discovered in a dark place in your own life? Share it in the comments below. Let's fill this space with stories of resilience, of people who know how to rebuild. Your story matters. And if this story mattered to you, please subscribe. We all have a story worth telling. This is just a piece of mine.
Bonjour, 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 bonjour les gens, excusez-moi. Je vais encore crever, hein, c'est sûr. Regardez tout ce qui lui reste. Pourquoi il est aussi dur dès le début du jeu? Je spamme les touches, je sais même pas sur quoi j'appuie. Non. Non. Catastrophe. Allez, 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 allez. Oh, bordel. Merde, 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 merde. Reviens. Je suis qu'à la moitié. C'est une catastrophe. Ah, puis ça me fatigue parce que je peux pas vous parler en même temps. Et puis t'as tout le temps. Il s'arrête jamais. Il s'arrête jamais, quoi.